Please welcome Professor Bart Defrank, Department of Translation, Interpreting and Communication, Faculty of Arts and Philosophy of Ghent University, Belgium. Please welcome our next speaker.
Thank you. It works, doesn't it? Okay, let's just agree. I've just come from Brussels. I couldn't be here this morning because one of my PhD students defended her PhD yesterday afternoon. So I've just come from Brussels. In Brussels, it's still 2:30 now. All agree on that? Okay. Do I have a pointer here to switch or should I just say the next? Yeah, okay. Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to cover, and I think I'm going to try and give an answer to Svetlana's questions, the ones that she asked at the end of her presentation. The title may be a bit provocative. The aim of my paper here, of my presentation, is also to empower translators. And I think that Svetlana is doing a good job at empowering translators. There is a general lack of trust in the field, especially in the legal field, with regard to translators. I can give you a whole list of quotes of legal professionals saying nasty things about translators. Yeah? I just give you one here. Discrepancies in EU. Oh boy, sorry, that was the wrong button. So you have seen it all now. Right. Discrepancies in EU law are the result of translators' slovenliness. Right, good. That's something that we hear often, isn't it? That's also why EU institutions recruit lawyer linguists. Lawyer linguists are actually lawyers who do the revision work, the legal revision work of the translations. And that's also why we have all these top-down strategies like guidelines, templates, quality assurance, etc., etc. Okay. The lack of trust often leads to ill-conceived translation strategies. You can read things in the literature, even the literature from the 90s, where legal specialists tell translators, look, what you have to do is translate word for word, sentence per sentence, and even respect punctuation. This is a quote in French, but I think you can recognize the terms. That's also one of the reasons why translation studies in the legal field, I think, lags behind because the conceptions about translation in the legal field are so different from conceptions of translation in other fields. I'm going to make a claim, and I put it in red to attract your attention. In some multilingual societies, translators are lawmakers, okay? And sometimes, perhaps, even better ones than the official legislators. Okay? Let's just think 2 seconds about that. The reaction that I normally get when I say these sorts of things is this. So I'm going to try to empower translators. Yeah? I'm going to try to build a case for that. I'm going to restrict the context in which my claim holds, I think. So the situation that I'm speaking of is, has to comply with a number of criteria. First of all, so the law that you translate should be multilingual. The law needs to be formulated in one of the languages first and then translated in the other languages. All versions need to be equally authentic. The law needs to apply to citizens, and it also needs to be enforced by an independent court. These are the different criteria that create a context in which translators can actually be better legislators than the legislators themselves. Yeah? And coincidentally, this very nicely corresponds to the EU context. Right? The EU context fulfills all these different criteria. No? So what do we have in the EU? We have a uniform legal framework for 28 member states, which is expressed in treaties, legislations, but I should also say case law, etc. It applies directly to citizens, which makes it a very special kind of international law, because usually international law does not apply to citizens, to individual citizens or companies, but EU law does. via the concept of direct effect. EU law is expressed in 24 official languages, equally authentic versions, right? So all these languages are equally authentic. And that creates a kind of legal fiction, because the EU will say that there is no original, there are no translations. So you can't call a linguistic version of legislation, you can't call the linguistic version of a treaty a translation. It's forbidden. Yeah? I mean, obviously these are translations, but in legal terms they aren't. Of course, we all know that in reality, I mean, all this is translated mainly from English. English is the source text, and all the other texts are usually target texts. But in legal terms, they are not. Okay? They are different versions, and that's also the terminology that the Court of Justice has always used, linguistic versions. The court avoids the word translation in every case. That makes translators lawmakers, of course, because translating a text, if that text is to become a law, alongside the source text, then of course, as a translator, you become a kind of lawmaker. There is legal monitoring in the institutions. Oh, I'm sorry. There is legal monitoring by lawyer linguists, as I said. So the translator is a lawmaker, but the work of a translator will be checked by someone else. And of course, we all know that there can be differences, discrepancies between these versions. Okay? However, when the court considers these differences, because it's the Court of Justice of the European Union who has the monopoly on interpretation of the treaties and legislation, if the court detects discrepancies, the court, for instance, will never say that the version is wrong. That's part of the legal fiction. So what the court will do is say, this version has to be read in accordance with. That's the typical phrase that you get. Yeah? So the legal truth, the legal intent, is to be found in all the versions jointly. And that's a very important part of EU law. Okay? So you never look at one particular text. The court will never consider one particular version. It will always look at all the versions of EU law in order to know what the legal truth or the legal intent is. Now, I've tried to model this a bit. I mean, I think that you, as translators, you all recognize this model, right? Where you have texts, a source text here, then you derive the meaning from the source text, you try and reflect on the intent or what could be the purpose of this text. Then, as a translator, you try to express that in another meaning in the other language, and then formulate a text in order to match the meaning as closely as possible. So the work that you do in the translator as a lawmaker model is actually the work of a judge, interpreting what is there, interpreting the text, and then at the other side, that's the legislator's part. Try to phrase things in a particular way so that your text becomes a law. There are other models, of course, because, for instance, in Canada, legislation is not really translated. It's co-drafted in different languages at the same time, in French and English. So then you don't get this transfer from one language to another, because the two versions of the legislation emerge or simultaneously. Now, usually what lawyers tell us is that we aren't good legislators as translators. We do not express, we do not interpret law as well as they would do. And I think that this is an exaggerated claim. Why wouldn't we be good in trying to interpret legal intent? I mean, we're professionals, aren't we? Why wouldn't we be good at expressing legal intent? You also have to remember that legal intent is a social construct. It varies. It varies according to time. It varies according to the community for which the legal intent is meant. It varies according to the legal context, etc. It varies according to people who have different interests, and so on. Yeah? The cartoon that I've put here is interpretations of the Second Amendment by the founding fathers of the US. Second Amendment is about militia and weapons and so on. So the Americans have the right to carry weapons, to protect their rights. The Second Amendment nowadays is sometimes interpreted as giving people the opportunity to buy as many weapons as they like, assault weapons, and so on. So the legal intent varies according to the community for which the law is made, according to the time frame in which the law is made, etc. The only thing that we lack, of course, is this: authority. Yeah, we're not the lawyers, we're not the court, and we don't manipulate the discourse on the law. We don't create ourselves the conditions in order to make the law operative. Nevertheless, Now, do EU translators make mistakes? Of course, plenty. I can give you a couple of examples, but for reasons of time, I'm just trying to accelerate a bit. There has been one not very, well, quite recently, that actually caused a row between Angela Merkel and François Hollande, when François Hollande was still president of France, on an omission that was made in the French text when you compared it to the English text. And Angela Merkel was angry about the omission. There has been, for more than 15 years, an error in the treaty on competition law where the Italian version says and for those who know Italian, or those who don't know Italian, it means and in Italian, whereas the English text says or, and that makes an enormous difference, of course. Yes? So yes, they make mistakes, but do legislators make mistakes? Do legislators fail to express legal intent correctly? Of course they do. I mean, if I look at the official bulletin of legislation in Belgium, well, 10% of it is corrigenda of laws that were, or the legal intent that was wrongly expressed in the law. No? So yes, drafters make mistakes. Do translators in that particular context get it right? That's the question for today. So the drafter makes a mistake, but the translator is right. Ha! And I will give you 3 cases of that, if I have time for that. You decide? Yeah. Okay. So this is actually the whole idea of the original must be faithful. The translation is actually better than the original. I'll show you 3 cases of that. It's all about quality, isn't it? Case study 1 on excise duties. Excise duties are kind of tax. No? Excise duties on cigarettes, tobacco, etc. There is law on that, Regulation 12 from 1992, that says in English, as regards products acquired by private individuals for their own use. It's difficult, isn't it? Well, you all have that experience, I think. And transported by them, the principle governing blah, blah, blah. Okay, good. Now the Danish version says, de zelf medfører. And there is a small difference between these two. Because in English, according to the defendant in the case that I'm going to show you, in English, transported by them also means have transport arranged for it. Right? Whereas the Danish is much more precise, it's much narrower. It means that you have taken along with you. Okay? Good. Danish is never the source language of EU legislation, I can assure you. So the source language in this case was probably French. So that's why I've underlined it. And French uses exactly the same phrase here as English does. Okay? So Danish is definitely a translation, and the Greek version probably too. It's not a source text. Okay, now just the case in a few seconds. There is a case brought against a British company who actually hired truck drivers to go to Luxembourg, where the excise duties were much lower than in the United Kingdom. So these truck drivers were hired, and they had to take tobacco and cigarettes to the United Kingdom, where this company, ETC, then sold tobacco and cigarettes at lower prices, of course, because the excise duties were due in Luxembourg and not in the United Kingdom. Okay, so is that covered by Regulation 1292? That's the question, of course. According to the defendant, in this case was ETC, it was. But according to the Crown, that's how it's called, the Crown. According to the Crown, it wasn't. So they went to the European Court of Justice because the European Court of Justice has a monopoly over interpretation of EU law. So in that case, you're forced to ask a question, saying, how should we interpret the legislation here? Is it the English version, transported by them, so having transport arranged for that tobacco, etc., or not? And in this particular case, the European Court of Justice sided, sorry, this should be CGEU, so the Court of Justice of the European Union, so there's still a mistake. I tried to correct them all, but I've been up since 5 o'clock this morning. So. The Court of Justice of the European Union sided with the translation, saying that the Danish is actually more accurate than the English in this particular case. Right? I'm not going to read through the whole text because I don't have time for that. But remember, in this case, the court sides with the translation, not with the original. Study 2, you just stop me, Alexei, if there is no time left, okay? Because I have 3 cases, I can... 2 cases, right. Good. Okay, well, I'll just skip the second one then, because... Oh, well, no, perhaps not, no. Okay, just... The second one is... this is working. Okay, direct on VAT. VAT, another tax. Good. VAT on travel, the travel industry. Usually when you travel to another country. That makes VAT a difficult issue because VAT is different in all the member states. So for travel agents, if you are putting a package together with different countries, it can be very hard to calculate all the VAT. So the EU has a kind of exception to that, saying, okay, to simplify matters, we are going to allow you to do it in a particular way. Now, the trouble is that in the directive, so the original version of the directive goes back to 1977 and was probably originally drafted in French. This is the English translation. This is the first part of this. So French uses voyageur, which is the word for traveler, consistently throughout the whole directive. Okay? So the exception only is when you have a traveler, when the relation is between the travel agency and a traveler. Now, in English, in the first paragraph, it says, only the first one, it says customer, which is much broader, of course. Yeah? So the question then is, if a travel agent buys a package from another travel agent, is he covered by the directive or not? Will he benefit from the exception? So that's the question in this case. Okay, come on. Yeah. Just to give you an overview of the different versions. So all these are the codes for the different versions. So you can see that English has only once customer, but then uses traveler. In French, it's traveler all through the directive. And then you can see for all the different versions here, the only versions that consistently use customer are the Portuguese, the Romanian, and the Slovak. Yeah? So it's a mess, right? 8 member states in 2010 refused to transpose the directive because they already had legislation using the word customer instead of traveler, and the Commission had asked them to change that, and they refused. So there was a problem. The Commission started an infringement procedure against these countries, arguing that traveler should be used, or that the interpretation of the word customer should actually be traveler, because in 29 of the 30 occurrences in the 6 initial languages of the EU, the word was traveler or an equivalent. Yeah? Which is actually a non-argument for the court, because the court will never accept this kind of reasoning, saying, okay, a majority of the initial languages, etc., that doesn't mean anything. I mean, it's the 24 languages or none. Huh? The member states who were the defendants here said, we have actually proof of the fact that the Commission in 2002 wanted to change traveler into customer in all the other languages, but it didn't come through. Again, court sided with the translated version here. Okay, so against French, which was probably the original version, and actually siding with the Portuguese, Romanian, Slovak versions. So saying that every time that you read traveler, you should actually understand customer, and that this also applies to travel agents and not only to individual travelers. Okay. I have another case, but I'll skip it. But skipping isn't very quick now. Okay. I'll try to explain it during the coffee break if you're interested. But what I want to say, so discussion and questions, here we go. Are these particularly perspicacious translators? Did they know in advance? I don't think that was the case in every case study that I've shown you. In some cases, I think it's just potluck for the defendant in the case. What it clearly shows is that, and this was actually also the recommendation of Sarcevic in '97, it's the court that decides. So whatever we do, however we try to ensure quality, whatever efforts we make, it's always a court that will decide what the interpretation is, especially in the context of the EU, where the court has the monopoly over the interpretation of EU law. So it's perhaps not the super translator, in this case, that I want to illustrate, but just the fact that sometimes the court is on our side. Sometimes it isn't, but sometimes the court is on our side. And this is, I think, the message that I wanted to take home now. I thank you.